Our Christmas series will ask some questions about the things we fear. Statistically, if we trust the studies, we all have a few of them. I wonder what yours are. What are you afraid of? What's your fear? Maybe this very common one that a lot of people have called arithmophobia. Arithmophobia. Can you guess what it is? It's the fear of numbers. It's the way you get panicked and paralyzed when you try to start doing your taxes or filling out a form with numbers on it. Or maybe for you, it's the fear of a specific number. Apparently some people have octophobia, the fear of the number 8. See if Stevie Den can follow me here. And of course, octophobia, the fear of the number 8, is not to be confused with optophobia, which some of you have in the morning when the alarm clock rings. Optophobia is the fear of opening your eyes. Sometimes in the morning, we'd rather just leave them closed. Or maybe for you, it's some stuff at the office. Some people suffer from ergophobia. Ergophobia, the fear of work. Or maybe it's decidophobia, the fear of making decisions. And for some of you, maybe the reason you like to stay away from work is that you have plutophobia. Not the fear of a planet, but the fear of money. If you're afraid of your money, by the way, I'd be glad to help you with that. I can relieve that for you. And maybe it's not the stuff at the office that you're afraid of. Maybe it's a couple of things around the house that you struggle with. When I was a young boy, I had what's called ablutophobia. Ablutophobia, the fear of taking a bath. Or isotrophobia, the fear of mirrors. Cherophobia, the fear of hair. Or maybe pogonophobia, the fear of beards. I hope not too many of you have that one. And then, of course, there are sometimes scarier things around the house. Those of you who are parents, as you see your children getting to the age of 10, 11, 12, you might develop ephebophobia, the fear of teenagers, of adolescence. For some of you, perhaps the worst thing is something that's been called nomophobia. Nomophobia, the fear of getting caught without your cell phone. And then there are my two favorites. Wonder if you can guess what they are. Arachibutyrophobia, from the words araki for peanut and the word bitu for mouth. The fear of getting that peanut butter stuck on the top of your mouth when you're having your toast in the morning. And then my second favorite, hippopotomontrostis capitullophobia, the fear of long words. And then, of course, for many of us, what we struggle with is just fear, just the fear of being afraid, the fear of fear. Franklin Roosevelt, in his inauguration address in the middle of the Great Depression, as people were struggling with hunger and disease and turmoil at home, said this: "First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Fear itself, he said, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts. Part of me likes to think that my heart goes out to Roosevelt and the people he was speaking to who are paralyzed by that fear, but part of me wishes that it were that easy. Fears are often more rational than we like to admit. Sometimes we have good reasons to be fearful. Sometimes there are things that scare us that should scare us. In the Nativity story, the angels appear again and again to people who have what turns out to be very legitimate fears, and the angels don't mock them or belittle them to their fears. They don't say, "You shouldn't be afraid," but they tell them why their fear is no longer needed. They dispel their fears with powerful responses. And this morning, as the Nativity story begins at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, we consider the fear of Zechariah. Let's ask God to open our hearts. O God, our beginning and our end, by whose command time runs its course, bless our impatience, perfect our faith, and while we wait the fulfillment of your promise, Grant us hope in your word that will dispel our fears. Amen. The reading this morning is from Luke chapter 1, verses 5 to 25. Luke chapter 1. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, do not be afraid. For your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." Zechariah's polite, isn't he? "I'm old. My wife, well, she's advanced. She's not, it doesn't call her wife, but she's advanced in years." And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them, and he remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, "Thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me to take away my reproach among the people." This is the word of the Lord. The text occurs at a moment when any devout Jew would have recognized the process. Zechariah comes to the temple, and there were 2 moments when incense was offered. There was 2 sacrifices, one in the morning and one in the evening. And at the time of sacrifice, there were also prayer being offered. And so early in the morning and again late at night as the sun was going down, as the sacrifice was offered and presented, there was a priest who would be chosen by lot to go into the temple and to offer incense. And as that incense was offered on the altar of incense, the smoke would rise up. You may have seen what happens when a new pope is elected at the Vatican, and they put some stuff in the little wood stove they've got in the area where they're secluded together, and the smoke comes out of the chimney, and they know whether or not a pope has been elected. This would happen. The altar would be, the incense would be put on the altar, and the smoke would come up, and the people outside would know that the incense had been offered, and that would be the sign for them to pray. But on this day, when Zechariah goes into the temple to offer the incense, something unusual and scary happens. Zechariah is afraid. He's afraid for a couple of reasons. He's afraid for his people, and he's afraid for himself. Our text begins by telling us when this happened. This was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea. You need to understand that that's a loaded sentence. In no legitimate way, really, was Herod the king of the Jews or the king of Judea. Herod had bamboozled his way to get that from the Romans. Herod's claim to being Jewish was that he had once been married to a woman who had been half Jewish. He was now on his third or fourth wife, and his first wife had been half Edomite, who are intermarried with the Jews. That was Herod's claim to being Jewish and to having the right to be king of the Jews and king of Judea. And so he'd pushed this on the Romans, who had sort of backed him up temporarily. And Herod had an ego problem. He was very insecure, and he wanted to be sure to prove that he was a very good Jew. And so he came up with everything he could do to prove his Jewishness, including building a temple. By the time this is written, Herod had been working on this temple for some time already. Now you need to understand Herod's thinking. He wanted to be sure that there would be no doubt that he was a good Jew and that his temple was the best temple there had ever been. So when he gave the architects the measurements to build his new temple, he said, I want you to take the length of the tabernacle in the Old Testament, add to that the length of Solomon's temple, add to that the length of Nehemiah's temple, multiply it by 2, and then add 1, because I'm going to have a bigger temple than anybody else, because my temple is going to be the biggest and the best. Now, some Jews didn't take well to Herod's temple. You need to understand that Herod wasn't exactly a frequent worshiper at the temple. Herod was too busy with his mistresses and his wives and his orgies and his parties. But this was Herod's temple. Many of the good, devout Jews, in fact, had been so upset at the temple that they had checked out of Jewish religious society in Jerusalem. We called them the Essenes. They moved out to a community called Qumran in the desert, in the mountains, overlooking Jerusalem. And there they prayed together. They studied the scriptures. There they also preserved manuscripts that we would find in the Dead Sea Scroll finds in 1947. And as they stood in the foothills, out in the mountains, in the desert, they would pray. And they were standing there, sitting there, praying and watching, waiting for the day when God in his anger would destroy Jerusalem and burn down this heathen temple built by this heathen pagan King Herod. And so the jury was really out as to whether good, devout Jewish people should even be in the temple, much less worshiping there, much less serving as priests. So Zechariah has a real moral dilemma. He is devout before God. He is serving God. He is Levite. He's a priest by lineage. This is his calling. This is his job. But now he has to fulfill this function to God in this temple that's, well, not quite sure. Is this the legitimate temple? Is it not? It's interesting that Zechariah and Elizabeth's son, John the Baptist, when he begins his ministry, wants nothing to do with the temple. He moves out to the desert and baptizes people there and urges them to repent from that false religion that's happening. There are questions about to what extent John the Baptist, in fact, had been influenced by the Essenes in the community of Qumran in the desert where he was baptizing in the Jordan. And so here is Zechariah as he comes into the temple on this day with the question in the back of his mind, should I be here? Is this still where God is? You need to understand that God had not spoken for 400 years. When you look at your Bible, there's that blank page between the Old Testament and the New Testament. After God had spoken to Malachi, he doesn't say a word to anybody for 400 years. And so there are Jewish people who are quite happy with things. They're in league with the Romans. Things are going well. Don't question a good thing. He built this nice temple. Just take it. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. There's some who've checked out. And Zechariah and his wife are agonizing. What does it mean to be devout to God? What does it mean to follow the commandments? What does it mean to keep serving God when you're in the middle of this strange compromise of a temple? Now, several times in history, when God had been displeased with the temple, things didn't go well with the priests. There was a point, in fact, in the history of Israel where the temple had gone rogue and things had gotten so bad that God had started to strike priests dead when they were in the temple at the time of service because he was that upset. There's a point, in fact, in their history when so many priests had been struck dead when they went into the holy place that they had started a tradition of tying a rope around their left ankle, so when he got struck dead offering incense on the altar, nobody had to risk their lives to go in and get the body. They could just pull the rope and drag the body out. So when you're a priest going into the holy place after all of that, let's just say it wasn't easy to get life insurance. And so as Zechariah walks into the holy place with the incense to offer it on the altar, an angel appears. In any rational mind, you are scared out of your wits. Zechariah thinks maybe this is it. Maybe I'm the next one who's going to get dragged out by the rope around his ankle. After 400 years, God is going to speak again. And I don't even want to guess at how angry God is. And Gabriel says, man, is God upset? God says, don't make me come down. No. Gabriel says, don't be afraid. But then he makes it personal. He says, Zechariah, don't be afraid. Your prayer has been heard. Now, Zechariah was also worried for himself. There's a strange little phrase. When the text introduces us to Zechariah and Elizabeth, it says this. Zechariah had a wife from the daughters of Aaron. Her name was, now this was a good priest. I mean, not only was Zechariah a good Levite, not only was he a good priest, but he wanted to be sure to marry a good wife who would be supportive in ministry, and he actually married a wife who was also in the lineage of Aaron. He wanted to make sure that, and the two of them together were a devout couple. They were both called to serve God. They were both loyal to their calling. It says they were devout and they were both righteous before God. They walked blamelessly in all the commandments and all of the statutes of the Lord. But they had no child. Why are those two related? Because it was thought that when you walk blamelessly and righteously before God, God would bless you, and you'd be wealthy, and you'd be rich, and you'd have children. And if you did not have a child, it's because you had done something wrong. It's because there was some sin in your life. It's because God was punishing you. In fact, it was very interesting. The Hebrew expression for a woman who's barren is a woman whose womb has been closed. The inference being is if you don't have any children, God did it. God decided you're not deserving of having a child. Sorry, you're barren. And so here's Elizabeth and Zechariah. They have been praying for a child. They have been devoutly serving God. They followed the statute. They followed the commandments. But they don't have any children. And so every day, everybody in their entourage, Elizabeth says that God had relieved her shame. People around them had looked at them and said, well, they look nice, they pretend good. They go to the temple every Sabbath, but, there must be something wrong. They don't have kids, How good can they be? They're So their whole life, they'd been praying. And as Zechariah comes into the temple this day, it's a strange moment. Not all priests got a chance to do this, by the way. There were 28 divisions of priests. Abijah's division is the 8th. And so the 28 divisions of priests, they would take turns. There was a schedule, and each one of the divisions of priests would serve at the temple for a period of about a month to a month and a half. And so many of the priests would live outside of Jerusalem because living in Jerusalem was very expensive. The real estate was very costly. So most of them would live outside somewhere. They'd have a farm someplace. And then when it was there 5 or 6 weeks to serve, they would move into Jerusalem. They would stay with friends or relatives or rent a little place, whatever it was. And then when they were there, when it was their family's turn to serve, when it was the division of Abijah that was serving, number 8 out of the 28 in the cycle, there was Zechariah around the temple. And then all of the priests who were there were so many of them that they would draw lots to see who would get to do what. And by lot, Zechariah gets the privilege of going into the temple and offering the incense. Now, some priests would live their whole lives. They would serve as Levites, as priests, and they would never, ever, ever, ever get to enter into the holy place. They might sweep the temple, or clean out the carcasses that had been burned, or try and light the candles when worship started. Sorry, man. And many priests never got this chance. So Zechariah has the chance of a lifetime. We don't know how old he is, in 70s, in his 80s. His whole life he's been serving. This is the moment. This is that many priests never got. And I wonder all of the things that people had said about him. I wonder all the talk about them. I wonder all the shame and the embarrassment that Zechariah and Elizabeth had faced in their hometown. I wonder how much of that subconsciously Zechariah carried with him. I wonder every time somebody in the background made a comment, well, Zechariah and Elizabeth, yeah, they look devout and holy, but, they don't have children. You know what that means. There must be something wrong. There must be something wrong. Maybe there's a hidden sin. There must be. And on this day, as Zechariah enters the temple, he's not just afraid for his people. I think he's afraid for himself. This moment in the temple, in the holiness of God. And an angel appears. And I'm going to tell you, do a survey. Go through the Old Testament scriptures. Count every time an angel appears. Put a notch in one column when it's good news and a notch in the other column when it's bad news. Chances are pretty good. I don't know if you're 9 out of 10 or 4 out of 5. Chances are this ain't good news. Zechariah's afraid, conscious of his sin, of his frailties, of his uncertainties, the shame, of the embarrassment. Are they right? Do I not deserve to have a child? Has Elizabeth done something wrong? Have I made a mistake somewhere that I don't know about? Is this it? Am I done? And Gabriel says, do not be afraid. And the tense of the verb is interesting. It's not that the angel startled him. The angel didn't come around the altar of incense and say, surprise! It's not that kind of fear. It says that Zechariah sees the angel, he was troubled, he starts to think, he puts 2 and 2 together, and he says, oh, I don't know what you say when you're alone in the car, but that's what Zechariah says. Oh, fiddlesticks. And the fear grips him. I think maybe he started to shake, this old man. And the angel doesn't just say, don't be scared. He says, stop being afraid. And it's an interesting comment, because I think it's not just a momentary comment. I think Zechariah had lived in fear long before he entered the temple. I think long before he entered the temple, Zechariah was afraid for his people. Zechariah saw his people disobey. They lived devoutly and righteously. He saw the immorality around them. He saw the way the priests had made the temple into a business. He saw Herod that was there. He saw the people in Qumran who thought judgment was coming. And in another 3 or 4 years after this, Herod will be dead by direct judgment of God, struck down. And so Gabriel says, stop being afraid. And in this strange way, Gabriel brings him news that brings the 2 pieces together. Zechariah's fear for his people and Zechariah's and his wife's desire to have a son. And Gabriel says, This, this is a twofer here. 2 for 1. You know what? You're going to get your little boy. And man, that little boy, he's going to bring you joy like you've never had. And he's going to bring the hearts of God's people back to their God, and he's going to prepare the coming of the Messiah. Man, what an answer to prayer. In his wildest dreams, Zechariah had never dreamt of an answer to prayer like this. Zechariah had prayed that maybe he and Elizabeth would have, a little child that could help them with a little bit of farming, but whatever, just take care of it. And here they are. They're going to have this little boy who's going to bring them joy and who will begin the restoration and the redemption of Israel. Now, think through this for a minute. What are the odds? I mean, there's 28 divisions of priests, right? Abijah's division is number 8 on the list of 28. What are the odds that it would be Abijah's division's turn to be serving the temple this month? And then the hundreds of priests from Abijah's division, they come and they gather when they start their service, and they start casting lots. And we're not told how they did it, whether they drew short straws. They didn't have playing cards, so it wasn't who got the 2 of spades. I don't know how they did it, but they had a way they did it. And what are the odds that of the hundreds, maybe thousands of priests and Levites in Abijah's division, that Zechariah is the one who gets picked to go into the holy place to offer the incense on the altar? What are the odds? No, wait. Do you really think this is a coincidence? And I started to think, man, I wonder how long God had been planning this. It's going to be Abijah's turn. They're going to cast lots on that first Monday morning, and bingo, Zechariah gets gone to the temple. Actually, God had been planning this for much longer. On a Sunday morning, when we have the time at some point, I want to take you back to Malachi. You know, in Malachi, the end of Malachi chapter 4, the last time God speaks, the tail end of Malachi 4, Malachi says, you people have strayed from your God. And Malachi actually makes a promise of the coming of John the Baptist. And he prophesies about somebody who's going to come in the spirit of Elijah, who's going to restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the people to their God. And the weird thing that happens is that when Gabriel begins to speak in Luke chapter 1, the interruption of 400 years of silence, it almost sounds like God started a sentence in Malachi chapter 4. He took a breath for 400 years, and then in Luke 1, when he begins to speak again in the temple through Gabriel to Zechariah, he completes the sentence that he started in Malachi 4. It's 400 years of silence for us, but for God, it's just like a breath. God had just not been planning this since the beginning of the month when Zechariah got cast by lots. God hadn't just started planning this when he brought Elizabeth and Zechariah together 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. God hadn't just been planning this during the decades that they'd been praying together and wanting a son. God hadn't just been planning this since 400 years when Malachi said these words. God had been planning this for a very long time. Since the very beginning, when we fell in the Garden of Eden, and God already knew what the plan was. And God knew that from Adam and Eve, there would come a descendant who would crush the serpent's head. And that descendant would come from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob, from Joseph, from King David, from Ruth, from Boaz. And then a cousin of his, little boy, devout parents who would prepare the way. As God speaks to our fears, we sit there with our fears, and sometimes it can feel like we've been praying for a long time. And it feels like God has been silent for a very long time. And there are things on our hearts that we desire, that we long for, that we think are good things, and there's been no answer, no response. And like Zechariah, we wonder whether God has forgotten about us. And then when we come into the presence of God at those precious moments, we come afraid and shaking and trembling, wondering whether God is angry at us, whether God is upset at us, whether he's forgotten about us. And it's not true. God still loves us. Over decades and centuries, he has been working out his good plan. And in ways that will startle you and surprise you, God has this knack of responding to the desires of your heart, of bringing you joy, and of bringing you joy in ways that will fulfill his plan. Imagine the joy that Zechariah and Elizabeth felt as that little boy was born. Not just the fulfillment of their desires, not just the fulfillment of their prayers for themselves, but the fulfillment of their prayers for their people, for their nation. And God brought this all together. When God tells you not to be afraid, it's not just wishful thinking. When God tells you not to be afraid, he's not making fun of you because you shouldn't be scared and you're still scared. When God tells you not to be afraid, it's because he's got it all mapped out. He's got it all planned out. He's had it all figured out for 10 years, 400 years, 4,000 years. And his plan is working itself out. God is in control. His plan is working itself out. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid.